Hello again, Applied English. Another virtual day. Not my favorite things in the world, but we can make lemonade out of lemons today. I do want to continue forward and up from slavery. So the way this will work today is I'll do a read through of chapter 3. I'll be reading straight out of the book that we've been using in class. There is a different edition of the book that I'll put up on screen as well. There will be some paragraphs that we skip over as we read. We'll be ready to discuss chapter 3 and move on into chapter 4 in class tomorrow. So, as I normally like to do on virtual days, feel free to pause this video if you have to say a prayer for your learning today. Otherwise, I will read through all of chapter 3 of Up From Slavery. The only thing I have for you homework-wise today is to be on the lookout for an individual message from me today. I've already messaged some of you who have significant missing work, but otherwise I plan to reach out to as many of you as possible today, just to let you know how you're doing and what to expect moving forward. Alright, so, again, you are watching Up From Slavery Chapter 3 video. I'll pull up the text on screen, but I'm reading out of the book copy in my hand right now. I did put a copy of the full text right here that you can follow along with. Just be aware that this is a slightly different version from the one that we've been using in class. I already have it pulled up on another tab here. Chapter 3 of Up From Slavery is titled The Struggle for an Education. We've just seen just the first year or so after Booker T. Washington and his family were freed from slavery. Now we get to see how he starts his educational journey. I'll try to highlight paragraphs as I read them. Just be aware that the ones in the text might read a little bit differently from what you see on screen. One day in the coal mine, I overheard two miners talking about a Virginia school called the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. In the mine's darkness, I noiselessly crept as close as I could to the two men. One told the other that the school had been established for blacks and that poor students could work for their board while learning a trade or profession. As the man continued describing Hampton, I resolved to go there someday. A few months later, I heard about a vacant position in the household of General Lewis Ruffner, the mine's owner. His wife, Viola Ruffner, was a Yankee from Vermont. She had a reputation for being very strict with her servants, especially the boys. Few of them remained with her more than 2 or 3 weeks. I decided that I would rather try the Ruffner house than remain in that coal mine. So my mother applied to Mrs. Ruffner about the vacant position. I was hired at a salary of $5 per month. Mrs. Ruffner wanted everything kept neat, clean, and in good repair. She wanted things done promptly and carefully, and she wanted absolute honesty. I soon went from fearing her to considering her one of my best friends. When she found that she could trust me, she did so completely. During the winter months, she allowed me to go to school for an hour each day. But I did most of my studying at night, sometimes alone, sometimes with someone I hired to teach me. I made a bookcase out of a wooden box and began putting into it every book I could get my hands on. I called the collection my library. I lived with Mrs. Ruffner about 1.5 years. The lessons that I learned in her home were as valuable to me as any education I've received. To this day, I never see bits of paper scattered around a house or in the street without wanting to pick them up. I never see a filthy yard that I do not want to clean, or an unpainted house that I do not want to paint, or a missing button on a piece of clothing that I do not want to replace. In fall 1872, when I was 16, I decided to go to Hampton. My family had used all of my earnings except for a few dollars, so I had very little money with which to buy clothes and pay travel expenses. John helped me all that he could, but that wasn't much because he worked in a coal mine, where he earned little, and most of his earnings went toward paying household expenses. I was touched by the interest that many older blacks showed in my going to Hampton. They had spent the best days of their lives in slavery, and hardly had expected to see a black child attend a boarding school. Some of these older people gave me a nickel or a quarter. Finally, the day of my departure arrived. I started for Hampton with only a small, cheap satchel containing a few articles of clothing. At that time, there were no trains connecting the Malden area with eastern Virginia. Trains went only part of the way. The rest of the distance had to be traveled by stagecoach. After traveling over the mountains most of the afternoon, the stagecoach in which I was a passenger stopped. Late at night, at an unpainted house that was a hotel. All of my fellow passengers were white. After they had been shown rooms and were getting ready for supper, I shyly presented myself before the man at the desk. I had practically no money. I was hoping to beg my way into the landlord's good graces and obtain some food and lodging, especially because it was cold outside. Without asking whether I had any money, the man at the desk firmly refused to consider giving me food or lodging. This is my first experience as to what my skin color still meant after emancipation. I spent that night outside, trying to keep warm by walking around. The distance from Malden to Hampton is about 500 miles. I hadn't been away from home many hours before it became painfully evident that I didn't have enough money to pay stagecoach fare all the way to Hampton. By walking, and by begging rides in wagons and carts, after some day I reached Richmond, Virginia, about 82 miles from Hampton. It was late at night. I was tired, hungry, dirty, and completely out of money. I had never been in a large city before. I knew no one in Richmond, and did not know where to go. I asked for lodging at several places, but they all wanted money. Not knowing what else to do, I walked the streets. I passed by many food stands where pieces of fried chicken and half-moon apple pies were piled high. I would have promised all that I expected to possess in the future for one chicken leg or pie. Sometime after midnight, I came across a raised portion of board sidewalk. I waited a few minutes until I was sure that no passers-by could see me. Then I crept under the boardwalk and lay on the ground, with my satchel as a pillow. Nearly all night I could hear the tramp of feet over my head. The next morning I found myself somewhat refreshed but extremely hungry. As soon as it was light enough for me to see my surroundings, I saw that I was near a large ship that was unloading a cargo of pig iron. I went to the ship and asked the captain, a white man, if I could help unload the iron for some money. He consented. I worked long enough to earn money for breakfast, which seemed the best breakfast I had ever eaten. The captain was so pleased with my work that he said I could continue to work for a small amount of pay each day. I worked on the ship for some days, sleeping under the boardwalk each night. When I had saved enough money to reach Hampton, I thanked the captain for his kindness and resumed travel. I reached Hampton with exactly 50 cents. My first sight of the 3-story brick school rewarded me for all that I had suffered in order to reach the place. It seemed the largest, most beautiful building I had ever seen. I presented myself before the head teacher, Mary Mackey, for assignment to a class. Having been so long without proper food, a bath, and a change of clothes, I did not make a favorable impression upon her. For several hours I lingered around her, trying to impress her with my worthiness, as she admitted other students, but neither accepted nor rejected me. Then she said to me, "The adjoining recitation room needs sweeping. Take the broom and sweep it." I swept the recitation room 3 times. Then I got a dusting cloth and dusted it 4 times, every desk, table, and bench, all the woodwork around the walls. I also moved every piece of furniture and thoroughly cleaned every closet and corner in the room. Then I reported to Miss Mackey. She went into the room and inspected the floor and closets. She took out a handkerchief and rubbed it over the table, the benches, the woodwork around the walls. When she was unable to find any dirt or dust, she said, "I guess you will do to enter this institution." The sweeping of that room was my exam, and no young man ever passed an exam for entrance into Harvard or Yale with greater joy or satisfaction than I passed that exam. Miss Mackey offered me a position as a janitor. I gladly accepted. The job would pay for most of my board. I had to care for many rooms and work late into the night. In addition, I had to rise by 4 a.m. to build the fires and have some time to prepare my lessons. Life at Hampton was a constant revelation. Using a toothbrush, bathing in a tub, eating meals at regular hours, with a tablecloth and a napkin, all these things were new to me. For some time at Hampton, I owned only 1 pair of socks. I would wear these until they became soiled, then wash them at night and hang them by the fire to dry, so that I could wear them again the next morning. The charge for my board at Hampton was $10 per month. I was expected to pay part of this in cash and work out the rest. But aside from a few dollars that John was able to send me every once in a while, I had no money. I made my janitorial work so indispensable that I was soon told that it would cover the full cost of my board. Tuition was $70 a year, far beyond my means. Hampton's principal, General Samuel C. Armstrong, who had been in the Union Army, arranged for me to receive a full scholarship. Because I couldn't afford books, I borrowed them from other students. Clothes were another problem. General Armstrong personally inspected the young men in ranks to see that their clothing were clean. Shoes had to be polished. No grease spots or missing buttons were permitted. To wear one suit of clothes continually, at work and in the schoolroom, and keep it clean was difficult. Some of the teachers gave me second-hand clothing from barrels sent from the north. These barrels were a blessing to hundreds of poor students. At Hampton, I initially shared a room with 7 other boys because space was at a premium. My bed had 2 sheets, something new in my experience. Puzzled, I slept under both sheets the first night. The second night, I slept on top of both of them. Finally, by watching the other boys, I realized that I was expected to sleep between the 2 sheets. I was one of the youngest students, too. Most were adults, some were as old as 40. Hampton's several hundred students were tremendously earnest. I was also one of the youngest students. Most were adults, some were as old as 40. Hampton's several hundred students were tremendously earnest. They spent every hour studying or working. Some of the students were still unable to master the textbooks. It made me sad to watch them struggle. Besides having to wrestle with their books, many of the students were so poor that they had to struggle for necessities. Many had elderly parents who were dependent on them. Some were married men who had to support their wives. Once again, I just read through the abridged version of Chapter 3. Feel free to go back through this video if I went too quickly or if you need to pause just to catch up. Again, we will discuss this entire chapter tomorrow and just get a start on Chapter 4. That would be our plan in class. Again, I'll be messaging some of you today just with updates as to where you're at work-wise. Until then, I look forward to seeing y'all tomorrow. Peace.